Okay, panelists, everybody got plenty of water here? Or anybody need any?
Nice.
Okay, excellent.
Make sure you give a sapper smile.
Yeah,
I put the size
this one's
photo
for
in.
you, Bill. Kind of wish you could be here.
He's a good guy. You know, I've run into Cloyd a couple times.
Yeah, you told me.
Cloyd was there for PCC.
Get out of us.
They were all nice guys. Every one of them was nice guys, good guys.
Okay, we're going to start in about 1 minute, everyone.
Get the map up.
Okay,
That's a good map.
Ethan has a synopsis first, so.
That's a good map. Don't let it go away.
Should have brought a laser pointer.
He said there was one, but they some of those things don't have.
I'm thinking one of those big, those green, you see those green ones that like you can see the moon.
Our big stick.
I have copies.
So you're doing the synopsis, then I get the first question.
Well, what I'm going to do is
Probably not.
before Dylan asks Jen to talk about the political situation. That's fine.
Okay, may I have your attention, everyone? Okay, everyone, welcome to the second session of Gettysburg 150. We're going to discuss the second day of the battle. At this point, our panelists from the to my far left, Terry Beckenbaugh, Ethan Rafuse, Steve Lauer, Kevin Benson, Deb Sheffer, and Jenny Weber. We're going to do a synopsis of day 2, and that's going to be Ethan. Ethan?
Before I start on day 2, we've talked about the political context here, and Lee's objective in his generalship is based around a presumption he can't destroy the ability of the North to make war, so he's got to break the North's will to continue making the war. And in 1863, one of the things he's got to take into account is the political situation in the North. And since Professor Weber has written an excellent book on the Copperhead element in the North in 63, I'd appreciate if you could talk a little bit about that situation, so what Lee is seeing happening up north.
Okay, well, what he's seeing is a North that is increasingly divided. There is a wing of the Democratic Party that is growing in influence, in size, in power, known as the Peace Democrats or the Copperheads. They're known by both. And they've become, in the summer of 1862, with the Union losses, particularly in the East, they've become more and more influential, and that has grown through the rest of 1862, now with emancipation, which is deeply divisive in the North initially, and with the military losses in the first half of 1863. There's another factor that's going on here, and that is that there is a former congressman from Ohio who has been arrested, tried for treason for what he has said against the government and against the war, and he was sentenced to spend the rest of the war in a military prison. Lincoln overrides that and banishes him to the Confederacy.
But it really became hard for him to get his 501c3 status through the IRS, right? That was the big issue.
Right. Well, it turns out that the Confederates don't really like him so much, nor does he like them, so they come to a mutual agreement that he should leave after about a month. And shortly before this battle, he has popped up again in Windsor, Ontario, now up in Canada, across from Detroit. And he's announced that he's running for the governor of Ohio from Canada. And, it does make a great and very entertaining story now, but Lincoln is very much on the defensive about this because it looks like this former congressman has been arrested for doing nothing more than exercising his First Amendment rights. So he's under fire politically. Now you've got this election that's going on in Ohio. You've got a governor's election that's going on in Pennsylvania, right on this ground. And in the fall of 1862, you've had these peace Democrats make tremendous inroads politically at every level of government. And since then, you've had the introduction of a draft, which is also highly unpopular already, and it's just ginning up. They're just getting ready to start drafting people as this battle comes in. So one way to think about this or any other war is a triangle, and on one corner, you have a corner. Can a triangle can't have a corner? Point, thank you. I didn't do well in geometry.
They're
okay.
historians, folks, keep that in
It's
mind.
true, and there's a reason. Okay, on one point, you have the civilians and their will to wage war. On another point, you have the politicians and what they're willing to do to push forward a war and support it either through money or through a draft law or anything else to wage the war. And then you've got the soldiers themselves. And so think about how they're pushing on each other and interacting and what they're pushing each other to do.
Okay, thank you, Jenny.
You're very welcome.
And again, one thing to keep in mind is Civil War units are not raised by the federal government. They are raised by the states.
Not after the Draft Act.
But for the most part, the regiments are organized at the state level.
By state, yeah, but with the draft law, one of the things that's this is my next book, sorry. One of the things that's interesting here is that for the first time, the federal government does take charge of enrolling men into the Army, and because it had been always a state level responsibility up until then, not a federal responsibility.
You also have a problem in the Army of Potomac in that you have the 3 years guys have been raised, but you also have some 2-year units have been raised, and you also have some 9-month forces that have been raised. And that creates a complicated problem for Joe Hooker or George Meade when they're trying to calculate who and what they've got in their army, who's coming, who's going, who's staying. And the big issue, the Pennsylvania election, Ohio elections, Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin has been a stalwart Republican. When Lincoln wants troops, Curtin will not say yes or no. He'll say, how many more than you want should I give you? And if you've got a situation in Pennsylvania where you've got an election between between Curtin and a Democrat, and there's concerns what happens if this Democrat, wins the election. And there's, if your book's looking at draft resistance and stuff like that in Pennsylvania and Ohio and elsewhere. Right. And if you can stir this up with stir up further war weirdness in the North, maybe change these governors, that can fundamentally change the federal war effort.
Right. You already have the legislature in Indiana that was threatening to bring all of its troops home or not fund them, and the governor there just prorogued the legislature, just never called them into session again.
That's the solution.
Yeah, it's one
Okay,
solution.
let's get to the synopsis of what happened.
All right, let's get to the battle. All right. But again, the basic thing is the connection between the war policy, what happens in the battlefield, and these things are very intertwined. All right, so we get here. We got a good map up here for thinking about the situation on the 2nd of July. Keep in mind, this map here looks at the situation in the late afternoon, which is very different from the situation when Robert E. Lee has got to think, what do I do next? The basic decision he's going to make is he is going to consult with his corps commander. The most important of his advisors is going to be James Longstreet. He's been the one who's serving under him the longest. He commands the 1st Corps, but he talks to his other corps commanders and develops a plan of action. You can see the Federals are in strong position on Cemetery Hill, and he understands that they also occupy Culp's Hill out to the right. How far south the Union line extends, as Lee is making his decisions, he can fairly see they extend south about from Cemetery Hill, down along Cemetery Ridge, to what is known as the Kadari Barn, which is, I need a laser pointer, but I guess I don't have one. As he can see it, the Union position does not extend very far south. His basic idea is to try to do what he did at Chancellorsville, which is maneuver his command and attack the enemy's flank, in this case, the southern flank. And the idea is to do through a march, get in position, and attack the enemy's position. That's what the far right of his force will do. In the center, he has got A.P. Hill's command, the 3rd Corps, which was so beat up on the first day of the battle that Lee is not going to commit much of it to the engagement. 2 divisions are badly beat up, but one has just arrived under R.H. Anderson, and that will participate in today's action. Over on the left, the far left, Ewell's command, which is to the north. There we go. If you move your little thingy over to the right, you see Ewell's command over there extends from there over to west of town. You then head south, and then you've got A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps, and just arriving right behind it is James Longstreet's Corps. This is the morning of the battle. The basic idea Lee comes up with, again, is to try to do a march south, get on the southern flank of the Federals, and seize position of a key piece of high ground that he has identified on the southern flank, which is the distinctive feature there is there's a peach orchard. And it would provide an excellent artillery platform from which to enfilade the Union position on Cemetery Hill from the south. If he can do that, get in position, he figures he'll finish off what he started on the first day. It is imperative that this takes place relatively quickly because he knows he can assume that Meade is concentrating his forces as fast as possible, and he does not want to fight a concentrated army against concentrated army situation. Time does not work in his favor, he understands. And so he makes this decision to make this march, to make this movement. James Longstreet does not think this is a good idea. He does not believe they should continue fighting at Gettysburg. He believes they should leave Gettysburg, move south, try to maneuver the whole army around Meade's southern flank, and try to take a position somewhere between Gettysburg and Washington and make the Federals attack him. This can come up in discussion and debate after through Q&A. Its feasibility, but Lee overrules him and orders him to make this move. Longstreet's march has a couple of problems. When they start heading on the route south, the most important thing for this to work is there's 2 things. One, march security is essential, and number 2, the Federal position has got to be, when Longstreet arrives, pretty much the same as it was when Longstreet started marching. You might think that's a ridiculous assumption, but Lee had made a similar assumption at Chancellorsville when he sent Stonewall Jackson on his march, that the Federals would be in the same position when Jackson finished his march as when Jackson started his march, and lo and behold, the Federals are very accommodating. So Longstreet begins making his march, and there's going to be a lot of controversy about this. As he begins moving south, the route he is led on leads him to a rise, from which he can see there's a Federal signal station on Little Round Top, which is on the southern end of the battlefield right there. If he continues to march along this line, it's going to be detected, and so that's going to be bad. So what he decides to do, in a rather lengthy, laborious effort, he's going to make a counter-march, another counter-march, and he's finally going to get his unit into position on the southern part of the field. You see the little red blocks over there. But by the time he's arrived there, the situation has changed. There are Union forces occupying the peach orchard. These forces belong to Daniel Sickles, whom Meade had given the order of extending the Federal line south from Cemetery Hill along what was known as Cemetery Ridge to cover the 2 high pieces of ground called Round Top and Little Round Top, sometimes called Big Round Top. Big Round Top and Little Round Top. Sickles got into position, if you move the little cursor up a little bit, and you see how Cemetery Ridge gets a little low in that area. Dan Sickles does not like his position. He sees the peach orchard out in front. He sees what the Confederates see. This would be a great artillery platform, and a bad one for whoever doesn't have it. So he decides on his own initiative, he asks permission from Meade, can I move forward? Meade and Sickles do not like each other very much. Okay? So Sickles is inclined to disregard Meade's guidance anyway. He asks Meade for permission. And Meade sends out his son, a staff officer, and then he sends another staff officer. But Meade really doesn't reply to Sickles' concerns. What happens then, Sickles sends out a reconnaissance of Berdan sharpshooters. They move forward to Seminary Ridge, and they hit the southern end of A.P. Hill's command. They have an engagement, they fall back, and this convinces Sickles that I need to go grab the Peach Orchard. He marches his men out, they occupy a salient at the Peach Orchard. The position, however, is too long for Sickles to occupy the Peach Orchard and cover the Round Tops. He tries, but it's not enough. And the Confederates, when they launch their attack, Longstreet launches his attack with two divisions, McLaws' divisions and Hood's division. Hood to the south, McLaws to the north. They smash and pulverize Sickles' position. They barely nearly grab the Round Tops, but fortunately, forces from the 5th Corps arrive just in time and are able to hold on to the Round Tops. Little Round Top, I should say. But Sickles' position at the wheat field and the Peach Orchard are smashed. A huge gap is opened up in the Federal line, and George Meade is able to seal the center of the line by bringing reinforcements from elsewhere. One of the places he's pulled the reinforcements from is a place called Culp's Hill, which was where Dick Ewell was given the mission of conducting a demonstration in favor of Longstreet's attack or something more if the opportunity arose. In the late afternoon and the evening, Ewell launches his attack on the 12th Corps' position on Culp's Hill. Culp's Hill is critical, and you see where the word Wadsworth is, because you see that little road right there called the Baltimore Pike. That is Meade's supply line back to his railroad depot at Westminster. So Culp's Hill is pretty critical, but due to the crisis created by Sickles' move, all the 12th Corps has left there is a single brigade under George Greene. Only 1,400 men to face the 6,000 men that Dick Ewell is going to launch against that position. Greene, however, digs trenches. He's got a very, very strong position and is able to hold on to Culp's Hill that night in a very hard-fought fight. In addition, Ewell launches his attack on Cemetery Hill with two brigades commanded by Hayes and Avery. And that breaks into the 11th Corps' position, but fortunately there's enough artillery on Cemetery Hill to finish fighting that off. The day ends, and the Federals have held the field. Perhaps most importantly, though, the entire Army of the Potomac has arrived at Gettysburg, and Lee is faced with the question of, I was successful the first day, hit them hard on their flanks on the second day, what do I do on the third day? George Meade is faced with a similar question. I got hit hard on my flanks today, I've got my whole force up, what do I do tomorrow?
Okay, thanks, Ethan. Terry, I want to start with you. Ethan has kind of covered Lee's thinking, but kind of give your perspective on Lee's plans for the day and what his key to victory was.
Well, as Ethan mentioned, Lee's plan is based on horribly flawed information. And again, I think here is where you could fault Stuart for not being around. What Lee does, and maybe Kevin can comment on this in terms of planning, but what Lee does is he sends out the topographical engineer of the Army of Northern Virginia out on the night of the 1st and the 2nd, that evening, to find out where the southern flank of the Army of the Potomac is. Now, his name was Johnson, right? Johnston. He goes out. He goes out and he tells Lee, I've been to the top of Little Round Top. I've seen that there's no Federals anywhere near there. And there's all kinds of speculation as to where he actually was, because he probably wasn't on Little Round Top. He's not familiar with this area. There are a lot of small, I don't know, I don't want to say small hills, I guess you could say, in that area, even though Little Round Top does stick out like a sore thumb. But anyhow, wherever he was, he told Lee he was on Little Round Top. So the best intel he has is that, Lee has now, is that there's still only 2 corps there, and they're not on Little Round Top. They're barely down Cemetery Ridge. So Lee decides to make this plan, as Ethan said, and the plan is sound. I mean, even though, when we look, I think you have to look at the second day's fighting, even though the Confederates don't finish off the battle, it's essentially a replay of Chancellorsville. They don't quite catch Sickles in the flank quite as well as they did the 11th Corps, but they do virtually destroy the 3rd Corps during the fighting. They destroy parts of the 5th Corps too. So, the idea is for the Confederates to attack up, I don't have it up there, but to attack up the Emmitsburg Road and again, to take the Peach Orchard and use that as an artillery platform. The plan makes sense if the intel is right. The problem is it's not correct anymore. And this is going to be a big problem because when Longstreet and these guys go out there, they're like, there's a whole corps here. There's a lot more people here that we expected nobody here until we got well over the Peach Orchard and established our artillery, and then we could kind of just keep going and push these folks off of Cemetery Hill and in effect into a vice. It doesn't work that way. And
When I threw the ball, there were no defenders there.
yes, well, yeah. And that's going to be a big problem. Lee's plan is not necessarily bad, but, if you have faulty information, your plan is going to be faulty because it's based on the faulty information. So realistically, what Lee is doing is he's going with the intel he has available. He can't make up stuff. Well, I wish they were there. He has to go with what they have. And so because, again, I think this is a big problem where Stewart is not there. He doesn't have cavalry out there scouting. He doesn't have good maps of the area. I mean, we take that for granted, with GPS and all those kinds of things. He doesn't have maps. So he's just going with this, I think it was Colonel Johnston had gone out and came back in the middle of the night and said, yeah, there's nobody there. And in fact, there's a kind of an interesting episode when Johnston is the guy who leads Longstreet on the countermarch, on this march. And they get to this rise around this place called the Black Horse Tavern, which is, if you've been to Gettysburg, it's out behind the Eisenhower Farm. It's way behind Seminary Ridge. And one of the orderlies comes back and says, sir, they can see us from Little Round Top. There's a signal station up there. They can see us. Well, first off, there's a signal station there. That's news. Okay? Wait, what are they doing up there? Nobody's supposed to be there. And secondly, they also, as Ethan mentioned, Berdan's sharpshooters, they're starting to run into troops from the 3rd Corps. They're like, wait a minute, the 3rd Corps is not even supposed to be on the battlefield. And this is really the dilemma that Lee faces at Gettysburg. And I'll try and be quick about this, but when you look at how the armies are structured, the Army of Northern Virginia is an army that does not have a big logistical component. In other words, it does not have massive supplies. But the counterweight to that is it moves very quickly. It's very maneuverable. And so Lee likes meeting engagements like what happened on the first day. The problem is, as Ethan mentioned, time is working against him. Also, the configuration of the fishhook at Gettysburg works against the Confederates as well. Because the Federals are almost in a circle, it essentially negates Lee's maneuverability advantage. So as time continues, I mean, the Federals are slower, but they have a big artillery advantage, they have a big logistical advantage. The first day, the situation favors Lee. It's a meeting engagement. He gets a big chunk of the Federal Army, but it's easily manageable. The second day, it starts to stabilize. By the third day, and we'll talk about this later, it's totally a bad situation for Lee. The entire Army of the Potomac is up. They know it. The Army of the Potomac is essentially in a big circle. They know that. And all the advantages that the Federals have are going to come into play on the third day with, as we'll see, disastrous results. So I think that's something to kind of keep in mind when you talk about the characteristics of the Army, because it's much more striking here out in the east than it is in, say, Vicksburg or out around here, like when you're talking about Price's Raid or you're talking about the fight at Pea Ridge or Wilson's Creek.
Anyone else have a perspective they'd like to offer on Lee's plan on day 2? What was the key to victory for Lee?
Basically, if he could get Little Round Top and if he could get parts of Cemetery Ridge under control, especially if he could set up the artillery platform on the Peach Orchard, I think he could have been in good shape.
Okay. Let's flip that. Let's talk a little bit about the Union forces. What was Meade's plan on this day of the battle?
Hang on.
Well, actually, Meade arrives about midnight on the 1st of July. And he arrives at Cemetery Hill, and he talks with Howard, he talks with Hancock about the situation. And his big question is the right place to fight? Because then they say yes. He says, that's good because I've already ordered the army here, so I can't reverse it now. And then he rides along. I mean, it's dark out, so he's trying to figure out what the situation is. But he pretty much makes sound dispositions. He's concerned about his right because Culp's Hill covers his supply route back to Baltimore. Initially, most of his attention is over there. One of the reasons Sickles is able to do what he's doing is because Meade's not paying a really lot of attention to his left flank because he's concerned about his right. He initially has Slocum and Howard, Gouverneur Warren, who was his chief engineer, conduct a reconnaissance and briefly thinks about making an attack against Ewell's position. But they tell him the nature of the terrain, the towns there, it's not very feasible. In any case, we've still got the 5th Corps, which is en route to the battlefield, and the 6th Corps, which is the biggest of the corps en route to the battlefield. So essentially, Meade decides to sit tight and see how the situation develops. So he's not really keeping much of tabs on what Sickles is doing. And finally, about mid-afternoon around 3 o'clock, with Sedgwick's corps finally arriving on the field, Meade decides to call his corps commanders together to discuss what to do. Now we've got the Army concentrated, now we make a decision about what we can do. But to that point, he gets the message that he learns that Sickles has moved forward. He rides forward to Sickles' position and finds out Sickles is too far forward, and it's too late to call him back because, lo, here come the Confederates. So from this point on, he's going to be in reaction phase for the rest of the day. That's pretty much what Meade's, and then plugging the gaps that Sickles' move created.
Yeah, what was Meade relying upon to happen this day?
His Winfield. Well, one big thing he's relying on is Winfield Scott Hancock. When Sickles' command gets smashed at the Peach Orchard, the 3rd Corps starts falling apart. He puts the whole part of the battlefield under Hancock's command, and Hancock works like crazy on this day to plug that gap. So he relies a great deal on Winfield Scott Hancock, and hope he can plug the gaps. And he's playing firefighter here. He's just putting out fires as best he can.
Yeah, I mean, Meade's in reactive mode all day. Once he determines he's not going to attack in the morning, and remember, the fighting doesn't really start until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I mean, 3:30, 4 o'clock. Remember, there's no standardized time yet. Standardized time is something that doesn't happen until 1881. So literally, nobody says synchronized watches. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, U.S. Grant's the first general to do that, right? At Vicksburg, on the, I think, May 22nd assault, he calls his corps commanders in and says, synchronized watches, so that when he says, that's actually a pretty revolutionary thing when Grant does that. But Lee does not do that. And so, and of course, Longstreet takes that long time to do that, but the fighting starts anywhere between 3:30, 4 o'clock. It goes till well past sundown. So it starts late in the day, and this is one of the big problems that the Confederates have, is that not only is time running against them in terms of federal troops arriving, the sun is going down. There's that whole rotation of the earth thing. The sun goes down, and night fighting is something nobody likes.
And it's very rare.
Yes, it is. It's very, very rare.
In fact, this is one of the few battles
Yes.
where you see night fighting during the Civil War.
Yeah, and there's also a lot less light pollution. If you think about it, I mean, if you go outside, it's amazing how much light there is just from the street lamps, from all this stuff. If you were to go outside in 1863, it would be black,
Although I
except
think-
for the moon.
Isn't there a full moon at this time?
I think there was.
Yeah, this
One of the nights there is.
the night of
Yeah.
July 2nd.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the nights there is.
Yeah. No, I think there's a full moon when they're fighting at Culp's Hill, which is this day and overnight.
That's when Pendleton moves his artillery in preparation for the attack. He does it at night. When Pendleton moves his artillery, the Confederate artillery, in preparation for the 3rd day, he's doing it at night. And he makes the comment that it was easy to move the artillery because of the bright moonlight.
Okay, any other perspectives on Meade and the Union Army going into the second day? Okay, let's focus a little bit on some key elements, some key things that happen, and I'm just going to throw them out and ask you guys to talk about them and comment on them. What about Sickles and what happened to him in the Peach Orchard?
I'll take this, because this actually goes to my comments about politics. Sickles is a political general. Lincoln appoints him because he raised a brigade in New York City. He was actually a Democrat. And so this is important for Lincoln to demonstrate to the country that he has a bipartisan force beneath him. So Sickles has no training, no background in military arts whatsoever. He has a huge ego. He shot his wife's lover to death in front of his house in the 1850s, who was the son or grandson of Francis Scott Key. He was the first person to ever get off on a murder charge on a claim of temporary insanity. So he was already a known quantity when the war broke out. And you know, you want to talk about somebody with an ego. This is somebody who had an ego. And on his own thought, moved out into the peach orchard. Now, there is a huge debate among historians still, I think, as to whether this was a good idea or a bad idea. But his men got hit really, really hard out there in the peach orchard and the wheat field, and he left the Round Tops open. And Little Round Top is a key point, because if you can get artillery up there, you can be shooting down at a quite broad field and doing a lot of damage in there. So it's critical. Whoever has control of that really, I think, controls that whole end of the battlefield. And so this is the problem that Sickles created for the Union forces, and I can talk a little bit more about what happened to Sickles later.
Sickles' men actually loved him. They thought that anyone who would murder someone in the way that he did and for the reason he did would make a good aggressive leader. So they looked up to him for this reason.
And okay, so I'll get into the next thing about Sickles, which is also because he had an ego. He was afraid. Okay, so he was shot, I believe, off his horse with a cannonball, and it shattered his leg, and he knew he was going to lose his leg. And as they were carrying him off the field on a litter, he asked one of the litter bearers for a cigar, and then asked him to light it, because he was concerned that his men would be so devastated to think that he had been killed that they wouldn't be able to fight well anymore. And so he wanted them to know, see the smoke coming out of the cigar, to know that he was still alive. By the way, he sent his leg, the remnants, down to what would become
Walter Reed.
What would become Walter
Becomes
Reed.
Walter Reed.
It already was Walter Reed?
No, it becomes
became
Walter
Reed. And his leg went on exhibit there, the bones. And he would take his new girlfriends there every year on the anniversary of the battle to go visit his leg bones. And there's now a museum of military medical history, and you too can go visit the bones now of General Sickles' legs. They're on display still. Yes. I've seen them.
Yes, they are.
What happened to Sickles' troops?
They got beat up.
Yeah, they get virtually, I don't want to say annihilated, but they certainly get chewed up very badly.
It was awful.
Sickles' men are in, and that's the thing. You know, there's debate. What Sickles, the debate starts between Sickles essentially and Meade. You know, Meade says you almost lost the day, and Sickles, in typical fashion, says, actually, I saved the day. I pulled your chestnuts out of the fire. It came at a tremendous cost, though. The Third Corps was essentially not a viable fighting force by the night of the 2nd, and it really, I would argue, I tend to side with Meade on this one. I think that while I understand why if you go, and this is one of those things where, you know, we take guys on majors on staff rides, I can tell you, about on the map that, okay, this is high ground, but if you go to Gettysburg and you look at that's high ground. But it is Meade, I think it was Meade, that said to Sickles, at one point, well, if you keep going to the next higher ridge, you're going to end up at South Mountain. And that's to a certain extent true, but I think that, there's also some context about what happened to Sickles at Chancellorsville. At Chancellorsville, Sickles did not get outflanked, but Sickles was ordered by Hooker to give up a piece of ground called Fairview. Hazel Grove. And at Hazel Grove, it's a perfect artillery platform, and what happened was Sickles reluctantly gave up that piece of high ground, and the Confederates immediately put artillery on it and started pounding the Third Corps to bits. And so I think you can't look at Sickles' move up to the peach orchard and the wheat field without thinking of what happened to him at Chancellorsville. In fact, he even says to one of his aides, look at that ground, we're not going to let it happen to us again. And that's a key part in what ensues later on.
Okay.
But
And
he would-
as a result of this, Longstreet smashes through both of these locations and takes them and heads to the center, and I believe it's Wright's Brigade of Georgians.
Willard's. Rand's rights, yeah.
They
that's right.
actually crest it momentarily and briefly, and we'll get to more of that tomorrow, but the center had to hold. And so how did it hold? Hancock comes along and says, oh my gosh, I need people. You guys, 1st Minnesotans, get over here. And they have to plug the center. And I think 262 went down to less than 60 doing this.
497.
Yeah.
497?
47 came back.
47 came back. I must be talking about the next day then with my numbers. Sorry about that. But the 1st Minnesota plugs the hole that resulted from Sickles' decisions.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that. I think it's a very good point, Deb. I want to talk about that in a little bit more depth. And Kevin, I want to get your insights on this because you and I talked extensively about this. What did Hancock see, and what did he choose to do, and why did he do it?
Well, I think at the moment, as Ethan and Terry have been saying, and all of us actually, when Hancock arrives, what he sees is the remnants of Sickles' corps coming back and an organized force of Confederates that are building up momentum. And the center is at risk. And now it becomes, someone said, the arithmetic. Part of the arithmetic in the equation there is time. How much time do I need to buy in order for the rest of my corps to come up and other units that are coming? As again, as we've said, what was Meade's plan? Hang on and plug the gaps. So people coming up in units, organized units to plug the gap. I need 10 minutes. And 10 minutes is Colonel commanding 1st Minnesota, attack that, take those colors. And the colonel commanding the 1st Minnesota, he's not an idiot. He can look across the field and he sees a couple of thousand screaming Confederates coming, organized with artillery support. I'm going to my death, and all of my men are going with me, and yet they still attacked because they knew they had to buy time for the rest of the federal forces to come up and a hope to hold the line. So there's honor culture. There's pride in your regiment. We're the first, by God, Minnesota. We're going to attack. We're not going to say no. Steve and I have walked that ground together when we were a little bit younger than we are now. And it just made me, to this day, I have a hard time conceiving the courage that took. They knew they were going to die.
And you see this, though, with, it's not just the
Right,
1st Minnesota.
true.
The Iron Brigade on the first
Absolutely
day
right.
it has a very similar story. The Iron Brigade does not exist anymore after the first day at Gettysburg. It's gone. I was reading a guy's letters 10 days ago in an archive from a regiment in upstate New York. He was in the wheat field. They went in with 600 men in their regiment and came out with fewer than 100. So it's the bloodletting on this field is frankly unimaginable. I do this professionally. I read about this almost every day. And I cannot imagine the kind of losses that this is. And I read the letters of trying to walk over bodies, or how many, or that you lose all of your friends in one day, in 1 hour. And I cannot fathom it. I cannot wrap my head around that.
I think that's partly why we all kind of do this. I mean, I've told you, I've been to Gettysburg probably well over 100 times. You know, as a boy, my dad would take me to Gettysburg multiple, 4 or 5 times a summer. I grew up about half an hour away. And it never gets old. We would, if you're marching, if you're walking over, like, say, Culp's Hill, Dad we would usually go to the library, Xerox the OR. This is the days before the internets were invented. And it was always very serious. I mean, Dad, we had a good time.
Terry, O.R.?
Oh, official records, I'm sorry, the official records.
Of the war between the states.
Of the War of the Rebellion. Well, that's the official name. The government calls it the War of the Rebellion. But you read their words and you see this is the ground they talk about. I mean, and it really is humbling. I get chills every time I go there. You'd think it gets old. I mean, I'm 46 and I've been there, probably well over more than once or twice per year if you average it out in my life. And it's still, I think that's one of the reasons why Gettysburg is so compelling, because it is an emotional experience for people who want to get into it. And that's part of why it's so, that's part of why I assume a lot of you are here.
When you stand on Little Round Top, where Strong Vincent, O'Rourke, Chamberlain stood, and you look out at what they were looking at, because it looks the same today.
Essentially, yeah.
Essentially. And you imagine the hordes of rebels coming at them. You cannot help but be just chilled to the bone.
Okay, let me go back to first Minnesota. We talked about what the men must have felt. What was the Confederate reaction? What was the other side? How did they react? Did they understand that they were only being attacked by a company? Did they understand that, or?
No, I mean, they're surprised that they're being attacked, first off. And it doesn't rout them, but it does force them to stop and reorganize. And that's essentially what Hancock wants. He wants them to buy time. And because of the tactics, because of the technology, if you just have a disorganized mob, it's just an armed, disorganized mob. It's the formations that give them that kind of combat power. And if you're not in the formation, if you're not in the line of battle, you really aren't nearly as effective as you would be normally. So by forcing them to stop, forcing them to try and get some kind of semblance of order, it's going to take some time, and that's really what Hancock wants. So even though it's a brutal math, we talked about the math again, and it's a brutal math, Hancock, it worked. It served the purpose. I mean, and that's part of what, and this is something more that Kevin and Steve can talk about, because they were in the military, but that's part of what you have to do, I would assume, as an officer, is that you have to make difficult choices at times in that kind of situation. That's what Hancock was trained to do his entire life.
And Terry talks about when men turn into just a mob and need to reform. Part of the importance of that is that the morale and courage partly came from the guy on your left and the guy on your right, and being in formation and in contact. Once that contact was lost, and some of the guys on the field talk about when they lost contact with one another, they felt alone, and it was much easier to go the other way.
Okay. Steve, Kevin, you guys want to offer any perspectives on Hancock's decision?
Well, the other thing that helps is, and again, this is hard for us to imagine now, but the smoke created by all the black powder, and the temperature held the smoke down. So it added to, again, as Terry pointed out, it wasn't the shock, but like, holy cow, someone's actually attacking me, and I couldn't see them until they got close because of the smoke and the haze on the battlefield and all that. We're kind of groping forward. So, but the decision itself, you're right, it is. That's the only formal military schooling any of these people had was West Point, except for self-education, which some of the officers did. Hardee's Tactics was the book that they all read. Hardee, a Confederate officer, but was one of the Union before the great battles began. That's what they knew, but the man on horseback at that moment had to take a decision, and that was the decision that he took. As brutal as it was, the math of war grinding on. But it was successful. He needed 10 minutes. He got, I think, from all the books that I've read.
Not 15.
Yeah. So, and that was just enough.
But it's important also to look at the terrain. When these organizations form on a battlefield, they're forming in straight lines. And as they go through this terrain, as you pass through the wheat field, the orchard, and get to the Devil's Den, et cetera, where this counterattack is going to take place, all of that formation is gone. So all these individuals are moving no longer elbow to elbow, which is where they're trying, what they want to be and what they're trained to be. They're moving as individuals, taking advantage of terrain. So when they're trying to reform, and Hancock sees this attempt to reform these men as they come off of that terrain, it is the absolute correct moment to hit them, because they are not prepared for an actual organized attack. And although there are far more of them than there are the 1st Minnesota, and they make the Minnesota unit pay, it adds to the confusion of men trying to find their file, find their squad, find their company, and get back in line. And you see this again when the Confederates attack off of Round Top down and into the gully, and then up onto Little Round Top. They're not attacking in a line. They're attacking as a melee, if you will, a group of individuals all moving individually. So when we get to this in a moment, when that counterattack occurs off the top of the hill as an organized body of men, all those individuals are no longer touching. And that morale factor, which is I can touch the guy next to me and that's how we're supposed to fight, is very powerfully lost when you are individuals. And so the opportunity to turn around and look for your guys and walk backwards is far greater when he's not at your elbow.
Okay, I want someone to take a little bit of time. All of you jump in on this. Let's switch gears now to the defense of Culp's Hill. Why was that important? What happened?
Well, first of all, I think it was the timing of it. That was later on, as Ethan and Terry pointed out earlier, forces have been taken away. So the Southern plan is working to a certain extent because it's an echelon attack, and the natural reaction is to try to move to counter it. So I'm taking units away from areas that are unengaged. And so now there's one brigade. And unfortunately, oh God, I just spaced his name. Green.
George Sears Green.
Yeah. Has his men dig in. So there are fortifications, but it's still a brigade facing 6,000 or so. There's another tough fight. The 1,400 have to stand and fight. And when reinforcements finally come, they have to be cycled in. Because the other thing that we have to recall is the weaponry at the time, the rifling such as it was that gave what accuracy these weapons had, started to get fouled after repeated firing. And the effectiveness of fire becomes less and less. So you have to have time to come off, clean your weapon, take a breath, take a sip from your canteen, and then go back. So I mean, that's my first comment. Started off an incredibly hard fight that was just as vital as what happened at Little Round Top, just as vital as what happened with 1st Minnesota, at least my reading.
Yeah, I think that Meade was very fortunate to have, General Green there. He's kind of a unique individual. He's a West Pointer. He's the oldest brigadier, right?
Yeah,
He's the oldest brigadier in the Army of the Potomac. He's 61 years old at the time of the battle. His men, when the war starts, are kind of like, what, this old man's going to lead us? But they find out very quickly that the old man knows what he's doing. And, old Pap, as they call him, old Pappy Green, he understands, Green is clear, understands the value, understands how the potential of the technology they're using, and he understands the best way to safeguard the lives of his men. Green's one of the few officers of the Army of the Potomac who routinely digs in when he gets a chance. And in fact, on top of Culp's Hill, he has to send several messages to request to dig in. And basically they say, well, go ahead. If you really want to, go ahead. and Greene immediately has the men dig in, and it's very fortunate that they did, because had the Confederates attacked them, they may have been able to hold, because Greene's men were a pretty solid brigade, but the fact that they were dug in is what Kevin and Steve would call a combat multiplier. It gives one man the power of 2 or 3 in terms of his capability to defend a piece of terrain.
And Greene did have the advantage of cycling that
Yeah.
the South did not have. So the North was cycling in and, reloading and resting a little bit, and the Confederates were just still hammering. And so they didn't have any opportunity at all for those kinds of things.
There is a question, though, even if the Confederates take these positions, whether they can actually hold them afterwards, because the 15,000 men of Sedgwick's men arrived, but they're not, they made, it was a 36-mile march in 24 hours, something like that. So they need a little bit of time to rest, but at some point, even if they'd taken Culp's Hill, the next morning on the 3rd of July, the Federals are able to, reclaim what they had before, because they've got reinforcements to bring from elsewhere in the field. Also, the question comes up with Little Round Top. If they take Little Round Top, how much further can they push? Law's guys, just to reach the starting point for the march, had already marched. One of the things that's interesting from the battlefield is if you go to Little Round Top, you look way out to the mountains and you know where Cashtown Gap is, you know how far Law's brigade has marched that day, and without water. I mean, they huge physical exertion. So by the time they got to, even if they'd taken Little Round Top, I think the Second Corps, 5th Corps reinforcement comes up there to drive them off. They probably would have been pretty weak. But again, that's presuming that this does not create some huge cascading effect within the Army of the Potomac and it just begins collapsing. But again, these are sort of questions that you raise. How decisive was Little Round Top versus Culp's Hill? What do the Federals have in reserve? How was Meade prepared for these contingencies and things like that? But again, the Culp's Hill fight doesn't get very much attention, in part because the movie, the book, and for the longest time, it was kind of out of the way on the battlefield. And ever since they built the new visitor center closer to Culp's Hill on Baltimore Pike, it makes it a little bit more accessible, and it's a good site to visit. And again, standing on Culp's Hill, it's the terrain. I mean, Greene has got it's a pretty formidable thing that Johnson's division has got to attack. And keeping in mind, they made a huge march the previous day. They were out in the Cumberland Valley. They marched them through Cashtown Gap, reached the battlefield. They're tired too. So, great performance by Greene, but he had a pretty nice piece of terrain to hold on to.
And the progress that the Confederates do make on Culp's Hill late that night will play a role in the next day's fighting, as we'll soon see.
Okay, I should have done this earlier, but somebody establish a little context. We're talking about the physical exertion. First of all, what was the climate like in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg at this time of year? It was in July. I mean, so it had to be hot, right?
Humid.
And
Upper
address Deb or anybody, address the physical demands of being a soldier in the Civil War. I mean, one of the things Kevin and I, in talking about the movie, Kevin remarked that he kind of doubted that there were very many overweight soldiers, as many of the reenactors were, who participated in the movie.
Seriously.
But speak to those topics for a little bit.
Well, I'll start with that. You have the physiology of deadly force encounter and reaction to those things. You have men who were already probably dehydrated, exhausted, not fed well, have marched a long ways in, I believe it was in the upper 80s these days with high humidity. If you've ever been there, it is very miserable. So they were already not at their peak. So when you get the physiology of deadly force encounter, these only exacerbate their physical condition that they already have. Officers would comment that they would have to remind soldiers to fire their weapon instead of just reload it because they would forget, or they wouldn't hear it because of the noise of the battle. They would also, the soldiers would just completely fall asleep after a battle because they were so depleted. They had an adrenaline depletion through the battle, and you know that the only way to recover from that is to sleep. So all of these things played a huge factor, and when you have the heat and when you have the ground conditions, the fighting conditions, these guys are going to suffer. No one is strong enough or big enough to avoid some of these physiological reactions.
Okay.
And also, when you're talking about the marching, the road from Chambersburg to Gettysburg, that was a macadamized road, even back then. So it would have been hard if you're in bare feet or you're wearing crappy shoes, as most of the soldiers on both sides were. But the thing you weren't dealing with was dust. Most of the other roads in the area were dusty. And I don't know if you remember that scene from this isn't Gettysburg, but the good, the bad, and the ugly, where he comes up and he's like, "Hey, Viva Jefferson Davis," and they realize that they start taking the dust off the uniforms are blue, and they arrest them. Well, that kind of thing is fairly common. It might sound silly, but I mean, guys are constantly, especially if you're not in the front rank of the marchers, you're eating a lot of dirt. And that's a common thing. And you think, okay, well, how about if it rains? Well, if it rains, then you're walking in mud. I mean, just imagine, if you had a dirt road and about 15,000 people walked over the muddy dirt road before you, and what that would be like. And that's kind of what you're dealing with here, because it had rained previously, and it also rains on July 4th, the day after the battle, very hard.
Okay. We've talked about First Minnesota. We've talked about Culp's Hill. Let's talk a little bit about Little Round Top. Can somebody kind of describe the situation there and what occurred?
Well, I think Ethan mentioned it a little bit earlier. There's Warren, the signal officer, he was the engineer, goes up, finds a signal station. Now, the purpose of the signal station, then, they were not doing semaphore, but it was called a wig-wag system, different numbers of times up and down trying to send information, and these were scouts, but that's the only Union soldiers that were up there. Warren, pretty good officer, right at that moment, takes in the situation, sees there's no troops, sees the men who were Hood's division. I don't think he knew it was Hood's division at the time, but he saw Confederates coming, and on his own accord diverts a brigade, I think it was ultimately 2 brigades, to the vicinity to hold the hill, because he recognizes how important it was. And that's, again, there's a different kind of courage, but he's a brigadier general, he's on the staff of Meade, but he really isn't known to these folks. He just he rides out, and on his own accord, I'm a brigadier general, follow me.
Well, actually, the units that came up were from the 5th Corps, and Warren had been a commander
He
in
knew
the 5th
Patty
Corps.
That's
O'Rourke.
right, that's right.
Yeah.
So
That's right, it was Patty Rourke,
Yeah.
you're right.
So he knew Stephen Weed and Hazlitt personally, because they had worked together before. So when he came up to them and said, "I need you to do this," because most of the division that Vincent belongs to is James Barnes' division, and they fight in the wheat field. But the rear brigade is the one that Warren pulls off and sends up to Little Round Top to win its great fame. So there's a lot of personal relationships at that situation play a large circumstance. If Dan Sickles had asked them to do it, they probably would have not.
Exactly.
But I mean, again, it's just there are these cross tensions and personality issues within the Army, like there are within all armies. So that plays a big part of it. And again, Warren is the chief engineer of the Army, and his job is to understand positions, identify positions, pick them out. But when Meade took command of the Army on the 28th of June, he inherited Hooker's chief of staff, Dan Butterfield, which Meade did not think was good because he did not like Butterfield or Hooker. But I think Warren was one of 2 people he asked to take Butterfield's place, and Warren said no. So Meade had to take Butterfield and the staff that he inherited from Hooker to command, which is going to create issues for Meade later on, because these guys were friendly with Sickles, and when there's a controversy with Meade and Sickles, they're in a very well strategic position to do George Meade a lot of damage.
I think, though, that was probably the correct decision.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're thrust in like that, really the last thing you want to do is, okay, chief, you're fired, you're a new chief, and nobody knows what the heck's going on.
And that was
Yeah.
Warren's.
Right.
Warren said he'd rather stay as a chief
Exactly.
engineer. I think Andrew Humphreys was approached also. He said he'd rather
That's
be a
right.
division commander. And so BG's stuck with Butterfield. But again, the chief of staff commander relationship is pretty
It is.
important in an army. They don't quite have yet the Prussian system, but it's still a pretty important position.
So what happens on Little Round Top? I guess most people probably know that story, but take a couple moments to go back through it, to recount it.
Well, there is this large guy who was once starred in a movie with Jim Carrey. And he took command up
Which
there.
has been mentioned today already. Jenny mentioned Dumb and Dumber, so.
And there was this Irish guy, I guess, who was in it, and all kinds of things happened. And what happened on Little Round Top was the Warren arrived, saw he could look at, and one of the things they've done on the battlefield in the last few years is they've been doing a huge rehabilitation, have to remove trees and things like that. So you can really see from Little Round Top what Warren would have seen looking out to we have to map it, looking out to Warfield Ridge, and you can imagine long lines of Hood's division deploying, and just the words that would have gone through Warren's head, and when he saw that out there, to see, and he grabbed me anybody. And he grabbed the 1st Brigade, was Vincent's brigade from Barnes's division, and sent him up to Little Round Top to hold the southern part of it. There was a problem in the Confederate attack. The Hood's division was deployed, the way it was 4 brigades up, 2 brigades up, 2 brigades back. In the lead, on the right, he had Law's brigade, which again had just made a 20-mile march at least to just reach the field. On the left was Robertson's brigade, was the old Texas brigade, which Hood had formerly commanded. In the right, in the second line, on the right was, not Sims, but Benning's brigade, Benning's Georgia brigade. And the left rear was G.T. Anderson's brigade. G.T. Anderson's brigade veers off to the left to go fight in the wheat field. The other 3 make the attack on Little Round Top, Devil's Den, Houck's Ridge, and into the Valley of Death. The problem develops, there are splits that develop there. Hood gets wounded early on by shell fire, and so the division just loses whatever centralized direction it has, and regiments begin flying off in all different directions. The attack on Little Round Top takes place, there's the attack in front by elements from Robertson's brigade, Texas brigade, so Texas units, and then there's the element of forces that are coming over Round Top and then attacking into the saddle to try to get around to the rear of Little Round Top. Those are the forces that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's command. Vincent deploys his command with the 16th Maine, I think, 16th Maine or Michigan on the right? Michigan on the right, 44th New York, 83rd Pennsylvania, and then the 20th Maine. And the 16th, the 43rd, the 44th, they face the attacks of the Texas Brigade. And if you go on Little Round Top, the Texas Brigade attacking up this really rocky, it's every man for himself. Lines are not, they're just trying to attack up there. And they're just about to break through when Stephen Weed's brigade arrives, and Patrick O'Rourke's regiment shows up and manages to drive them back. Serious problem comes on the left of the 20th Maine because Oates has 2 regiments, and he attacks the 47th Alabama and the 15th Alabama. And they make a number of determined attacks on Chamberlain's position. And at times it gets hand-to-hand. The battlefield right now does not give you an exact image of what happened because in the 20th century something called Chamberlain Avenue was built, and that altered the spur between Big Round Top and Little Round Top. But you can still get a pretty good idea of what if you go out to that position there. And before in the 1960s, people didn't go out there, but with the publication of Killer Angels and the movie, everybody goes out there now. Chamberlain's a rock star. But, I mean, the 47th and 15th make their attacks on Chamberlain's position, and eventually they force Chamberlain to go from 2 lines to 1 rank lines, meaning instead of two lines, he just got 1. And eventually he decides he's got to pull back the left wing of his regiment in order to prevent the Alabamians from reaching around his flank. And then they begin running out of ammunition, and Chamberlain orders the bayonet. There is some controversy about what happened next. The movie, bayonet, they make the charge. There are other accounts that say what had happened was after the Alabamians fell back, some members of the 20th Maine said we should go collect some of our wounded and dead who are out there still in the battlefield. And when they started moving out to do that, that sort of carried a momentum of all its own, and the 20th Maine just started going forward. And Chamberlain was, oh, okay, yeah, all right. And the Alabamians were so exhausted at that point. Like I mentioned, just the march with no water, and they fall back. And Chamberlain is going to ride. A couple of decades later, Chamberlain's going to write about his experiences. He's going to write for one of these popular magazines that they've got in the North. He writes an account. And again, after the battle, Chamberlain was not viewed as above anybody else who fought at Gettysburg. But he writes this account. This is from Tom Darjen, who's written some really good stuff on the, I hope I'm remembering what he told me right. But what happened was they wrote this article. Chamberlain wrote this article, he submitted it. And then the editors did, as they were wont to do, made it this incredibly melodramatic story. So much so that when Chamberlain saw what they'd done to it, he disowned it. And he said, this is inaccurate. This is too much. I fought hard, but come on, calm down. But then the story comes, so the 20th century begins and moves along, and Chamberlain's viewed as no great shakes over Greene or anybody else. And then what happens is there's this American author by the name of Michael Shara. Michael Shara.
Right.
The son is
Jeff.
The son's
Jeff
Jeff.
Shara, yeah.
And Shara he meets with his fellow English professors, and they give him a little bit of job that there's no great American, Lancelot or great knight, no story of this kind of thing. And so Shara goes looking for this American knight, and he comes across this magazine article about Challenge Chamberlain that makes him again, Chamberlain himself has said this is too much. Shara takes it, adds his own little bit to it. Okay? So on top of being too much for Chamberlain, it's now going to be more than they had published before. And this goes into the book, The Killer Angels. So now, of course, everybody wants to buy the Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain t-shirt at Gettysburg. And then, of course, the movie takes it even further. And so the popular image of it is like 3 or 4 steps removed from the original thing. And one of the great dangers of it is because of so much myth-making, there is a danger of people, pushing back against it and losing sight of just how, in fact, heroic that Chamberlain performed at Gettysburg. I mean, it was an extraordinary experience that extraordinary performance he turned in at Little Round Top. Again, at the same time, the danger is we slight the members of the 140th New York in New York, and the 83rd Pennsylvania, the 44th, and the 16th Michigan, who themselves put up a credible. And again, not just mentioning, who is the man at the other end of the line from Chamberlain? It's the 137th New York with Greene's guys. And so there's all these interesting cross-currents. I think Darjen served as the historical consultant to it. And the image you get of Chamberlain was he's this big guy. That's because Jeff Daniels is 6'2". And Desjardins said that when he was the consultant for it and he met Daniels, he saw Daniels and says, Daniels, he's reality, Chamberlain's only about 5'6". And Daniel's response was, well, in the movie, he's going to be 6'2". Okay, and that's just the way the layers are added to the story, and it's a fascinating subject.
Okay, I'm going to go around because I want to get everybody's quick opinion on this question. Which action, and if you think all 3 were equal, or if you want to rank them, that's fine too, but move quickly. Which action was most important on day 2? The defense of Culp's Hill, 1st Minnesota's attack, or Little Round Top? Terry, I'm going to start with you. We're just going to go right around the panel.
I would say Little Round Top.
Okay, Ethan?
I would have to say the 1st Minnesota in the context of the general performance of Hancock closing up the center.
Okay, Steve?
Little Round Top.
Kevin?
I'm with Ethan, 1st Minnesota.
Deb?
1st Minnesota.
Little Round Top.
Okay.
No love for George Greene. Wow. It continues. Poor George Greene.
Well, they didn't make a movie about him, so.
Well, you didn't ask who was the most skillful.
Okay. Now, we're going to open it up to your question after one more question, but I want to throw this one out to the panelists too, and I'd like each of you to jump in as you see fit. Who is more important in deciding the outcome of day 2, the commanders or the troops? Who really decided the outcome? And explain a little bit behind that.
Well, I mean, I think, because, and not so much, I'm not really going to talk that much about Lee or Meade, because realistically, once the fighting, Lee lays out the original plan, but he pretty much, it takes a life of its own. I think when you look at, especially how the federal army reacts, I mean, I'm not going to say that Meade was worthless that day. That's totally unfair. But I think when you look at some of the key decisions were made, they were made not by Meade. Hancock makes the decisions. Warren makes a key decision. For the most part, the federal lower-ranking officers consistently make the right decisions. The Confederate officers, either they're faced with a difficult and almost insurmountable task, or they don't make the right decision. And so I think it's a combination of the men and the officers, the lower-ranking officers, who are at the sharp end of the spear.
I can't personally make a distinct, I mean, of course you want to say, oh, the soldiers, of course. Because they fought both sides fought extremely well that day. Longstreet later wrote afterwards, there was never a finer piece of fighting done on any battlefield than his command did at Gettysburg that day. For positive, if you want to think for positive, the soldiers, for negative, the commanders, but again, the commanders are working under such stressful, the same circumstances, the same problem, physical limitations and issues that add on top the stress of command. It's a lot that these guys are carrying at this battle.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I concur with Ethan. I think we all want to say it's the soldiers who do this, and the soldiers are the ones who do most of the fighting and the dying, but officers in the Civil War are in front of their soldiers for the most part, and the officer casualties that go through this are enormous throughout these battles. And in fact, the officers are the ones who place the men in the position to do what they're doing. And so without some officer's direction to be there, the things, good or bad, that occur there could not have happened. And to the extent that, as Ethan said, their inability to see the ground, to see the smoke, through the smoke, all those things are the typical things that occur on a battlefield. And once this motion is set in place, in gear, if you will, the soldiers themselves are really captive of that and have to go forward where they're told to go. So I think it would be very difficult to separate the two here and say one or the other is more important than the other. They are equally either doing good things or causing bad things to occur.
And what you said about the frontline commanders, they are, at one point the gap in the Union line, the only thing in the Union gap in the line is George Meade and his staff at one point in the battle. He is up front in the battle.
Any other thoughts? Kevin, Deb, Jenny?
I'm inclined to go with the soldiers. I'm with Terry on this because I think that under the circumstances, the demands on the individual are really quite extraordinary in a lot of these cases of having marched for so far with no sleep or little sleep, not much food, not much water, and then to be ordered into battle after that. I think at that point it's a personal achievement to be able to do anything and to function at all. And while I'm not going to go, diss the commanders, what I would say is that I would say it's the regimental officers who I would give the most credit to for executing and getting the men in line more than Meade, but that would be my inclination.
Okay.
And I don't know how many of the regimental officers fell dead and wounded, but it was significant. And so that shows right there that they were definitely in the front lines and trying to do their best.
Kevin, you get
No,
the
I
last
absolutely agree
word.
with Jenny, actually. All the reading I've done and all the thinking about this, the soldiers had to have something to believe in. And I think they believed in their regimental officers. And I think that went both ways. And I think that was the key.
Can I butt in on this? Because we haven't
Of
talked
course,
about this
you were
at
my
all.
professor.
We haven't talked about this at all, about really what the soldiers are there fighting for and what they believe in. And if you north or south, by the time you get to this point in the war, they're fighting for each other as much as anything. And they may fight for their officers, but they're more fighting for each other. The unit cohesion there is really important, and I think plays a really big role in explaining why more people aren't running away. That, and we get back to this honor culture idea of, boy, you know, if you run, you better believe that this guy next to you is going to be writing home, and his mother lives next to your mother, and suddenly, you know,
Yeah, 'cause
you've
that's-
got a reputation to deal
Because
with.
the individual companies are raised by hometown.
Right.
So literally, if you do run, you're not gonna be able to go back home.
Right.
And
And
that's a big
hometown
thing.
people, if they felt like men weren't enlisting soon enough or fast enough, they might even go so far as to provide that man with a white apron to show that they really did not.
I think
I
Jen's
think
work
that's-
is
I think that's early in the war.
Yeah, early in the war, not
Yeah,
at this point, but
not
early
at
in the
this
war,
point.
that's how the
Right.
hometown people felt.
When George Meade takes command, one of the first things he does is issue an order and says, any soldier who doesn't do his duty, his officers are authorized to put him to death. That's, you know, the Army, you know, a lot of incentives for getting in, but the Army makes it very hard for you. It creates a great number of disincentives for you not to do your job. for you to-
Exactly,
you
so
know.
I was
Yeah.
definitely talking about early on in the
Yeah.
war. By this point, like Jenny says, a lot of things have changed
Yeah.
about battle motivation. Big time.
One of the key factors that impacts their cohesion is this idea that officers who, in this particular, in all times actually, but especially here as well, officers who instill requirements for discipline, requirements for health and welfare, who stand in front of them, or have an extraordinary impact on both the cohesion that develops within the unit and the fact that the unit is there at all in the fight. The weakest performing units were always those units, at least in the literature of the letters, were those units where the officer did not influence or require disciplined behavior. Principally, disciplined behavior, not necessarily in the line of battle, but in things like, what do we call it?
Hygiene?
Personal hygiene.
Yeah.
The very fact that they were kept clean, that they had to change, officers had to inspect them to see that their feet were okay, that they dug latrines, as an example, behind their positions, and recognizing that there's, you know, the disease was the primary killer of soldiers in the Civil War. I did a study of 3 companies in Florida who were enlisted in 1862 that had 35 deaths in the Civil War. 34 of the 35 deaths were disease. Only 1 soldier out of these 3 companies that died in battle. So I think the idea that the cohesion that develops within a unit is fundamentally based on where they come from. This idea that you come from the same hometown, you come from the same state. In the Confederate Army, the state that you came from, the reason why the South had so much difficulty in consolidating regiments was because they refused to be consolidated, because they would lose their state identity. Their officers were generally chosen from amongst them if they were junior officers. And
That was
and what-
true. That was true in the Union Army too. They elected their officers.
And I think one of the impacts in this battle that is powerful is the presence of Robert E. Lee on the South Side, and we talked earlier, the belief that if you're going to have me do this, and Lee's present on the battlefield, it must be okay, and I'm going to go forward and do this. But I think that, and all of these soldiers in this battle in particular, almost all of these are veterans. These are soldiers that have been in battle they've been fighting each other. There's a tremendous amount of respect between these two armies that will play out after the last day, because they have fought each other tooth and nail since 1861. And so I think the cohesion of the soldier is powerful, but the impact of the officers who lead them and what they do with them, what they require of them, is a very powerful impact on their ability to go forward.
Okay, we're going to open it up to your questions and answers. If you have a question, please queue up in the back corner. And we will get to it. We'll try to do as many as we can. We're going to conclude at precisely at 4:15. Okay, let's go. Brief question.
Brief. We're talking about day 1 and day 2 and day 3. What about night 1 and night 2? You mentioned Meade arriving at midnight with a full moon. What happened to the troops? Did they have time to rest? Did they sleep? Were they too wound up? There was mention of Green's men digging in. What did dig in mean? Does it mean digging foxholes? And was the Red Cross present? Age levels of these troops on both sides? And what happened to the dead and wounded?
Okay, I'm going to collapse that and try to get that into one question that we can have our panelists address. Just address what happened to the troops at night. Some of them might have been fighting, some were trying to sleep. What were they trying to do?
They pretty much dropped where they were. I think that, was it on the third day or the second day, Hancock was up early and they heard guns in the distance, and the soldiers around them were still just sleeping soundly, even over the sound of the guns.
It depends on soldier, depends on the unit. I mean, if they're in the 6th Corps, they're probably marching. If
Yeah.
they're in the 11th Corps, they are probably trying to get the best sleep they can on Cemetery Hill. If they're in the 12th Corps, they're at one place. It just depends on the unit. In terms of medical care after the battle, they did establish a series of hospitals in the vicinity of Gettysburg. If you go to Gettysburg today, a lot of the buildings that were used for hospitals are indicated by, have been purchased by the Park Service or have been marked by the Park Service.
There's a bronze plaque on them.
Although informally, virtually every house in Gettysburg became a small hospital. There with so many wounded.
Okay, let's go to the next question, please.
This would be for all of you. Is there anything wrong, was there anything wrong with Lee's command structure, intrinsically wrong with a very small staff? Were his commanders, his field commanders, less able to make command decisions during the action as opposed to the North?
I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with his command structure, but he was understaffed. He had, I think 5 aides. I mean, good Lord, I mean, I guess I should be careful what I say here, but, you know, at Fort Leavenworth, we have a general come on post, and I mean, it's like a free-for-all, like 50 people, I swear, coming in the building, it's like, oh, must be another general here. You know, and I marvel that Lee had 5. Lee should have had significantly more than that. I mean, I don't know, Kevin, what would a person of Lee's rank equivalent today have in terms of staff?
That was a very skillful shifting.
A field army commander now would have, well, Jiminy Crickets. The field army that I was in, we had about 1,500 in all different kinds of staff section, from personnel to logistics to controller, doing, you know, tracking money. I've always been astounded by how well these armies did with how small their staffs were.
Well, to put this in some context, though, Lincoln had 2 secretaries.
Yeah, sure he
That
did.
was his entire staff.
Yeah, but I mean,
That's true.
Sam Curtis, during the Pea Ridge campaign, you know, in 1862, he has a staff the size of Lee's, which is not terribly big, I mean, by the standard. He's only commanding an army of about 12,000 men. Lee's commanding an army of about 70,000 men and has 5 guys.
Each of the corps have their own staff, have their own quartermasters, have their own ordnance officers. And again, I don't see anything in the Gettysburg campaign that you can mark up as a problem that you can attribute a failed staff work. I just don't see.
I think you, to a certain extent, the whole thing on the night of the 1st and the 2nd was poor. When you have one guy you send out there, and he comes back and says, it's clear, I was on top of a little round top, you'd think that there'd be more than one person. I mean, yes, you can blame some of that on Stewart, but I think that, you know, that's asking an awful lot, that's putting an awful lot of pressure on one guy to get it right.
Okay, let's go to our next question.
Could you help us understand the experience of just the average soldier in the middle of a charge? Did they run? Did they walk? How much weight did they carry? If somebody fell, did they stop to help them? What's that very intense spirit, flesh and blood experience like for the frontline fighter?
I don't know if anybody can adequately answer that. Yeah, I mean, in terms of weight, I mean, they carried packs when they marched, but the Confederates traveled a lot lighter. Usually, before going to combat, a unit would dump everything that was on their back. So if they were going to make a charge, they generally didn't carry all that stuff with them into combat.
But those packs were 60 to 70 pounds.
Yeah.
And then they're carrying a gun that's
About 12 pounds.
20 pounds. Figure, 10 pounds
Yeah.
or so of ammunition
And the
leather.
average soldier was 145 pounds in the Union Army.
Right. And
5'4",
what,
145 pounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know when I was a kid, you go to Gettysburg, used to have all these uniforms, and they still do, but they used to in the old visitor center. And I used to think, my God, there's a lot of little kids in the Federal Army. Well, actually, no.
Well-
That was the size of the men.
But, those men were, what's the average age? 20?
26.
25 or 6, I believe.
Okay, so it is
We have,
older.
yeah. So, I
Okay.
mean, but the thing you have to understand about a Civil War battlefield, it'll be interesting. There's a documentary that's being made right now that's going to try and do like a Saving Private Ryan type Civil War experience.
Yeah.
I don't know that they're ever going to be able to get it because the fundamental problem with a Civil War battlefield is, as Kevin mentioned, they're using black powder. If you're in a firing line and you're firing a lot, in about 5, I don't know, maybe 2, 3 shots in about a minute, you're not going to see maybe 10 feet away from you.
Especially with artillery fire.
Yeah, and if artillery fire is even worse. So, I mean, you might not know what's happening 100 yards away from you. And that's one of the problems about a Civil War battlefield. Like now today, they use smokeless powder, and they also use steel-tipped bullets. So when a bullet goes into a person, it not only has a much higher muzzle velocity, and so it's going much faster. It usually goes in, makes a hole that big, and leaves the other side leaves a hole that big. In the Civil War, they're using lead bullets, and so when a bullet hits you, first off, it's a bigger bullet. It's a 69 caliber usually for the federal.
Unjacketed too, it's just a slug.
Yeah, but when the bullet hits you, it squashes, so it makes a hole this big. If it goes through you, it comes out like that big. So, honestly, I've read all kinds of accounts, I'm sure you have too, of, like canister being used. And canister basically is just imagine a gigantic shotgun. It's artillery. And I've read accounts of people, quote, evaporating in pink mist. I think, honestly, if you were going to try and do a Saving Private Ryan thing, you'd almost have to get a XXX violence rating. I mean, you can get a XXX rating not just for sexual issues, but you can also get one for extreme violence. And, I mean, people's arms getting blown off, heads getting blown off, brains getting thrown. I mean, it's not a pretty sight.
Right, and then a lot of these guys, honestly, are so paralyzed by what they're experiencing that they think they're shooting and they're not. It's only a fraction of the men who are actually shooting their weapons. And the rest of them are just so caught up that they don't realize they're not shooting. There was one gun they found on the Gettysburg battlefield with, I think, 13 rounds.
Mm-hmm.
Just, the guy kept loading new
And
rounds,
didn't fire.
but forgot that he wasn't firing, which by the time you have the 13th round in there is probably just as well that he didn't.
Yeah. Let's go to the next question. Just a real quick comment.
Real quick on this issue of what happens to them when they're going in a battle. They dump most of this heavy load before they attack, and so they're really carrying in the battle just their weapon and ammunition and maybe a few personal items. But the issue of what happens to the guy to the right and left of them, you'll see particularly on the third day, when what happens when a cannonball, an iron shot, bounces into a line. It'll take out 2 or 3 guys. The order given by the company commander is guide to your right or close up. So when somebody is blown out of the line, what the soldiers do is they simply take a step to the right and close the hole. Well, you see what happens with artillery mounted on places like Little Round Top when this attack occurs, is this round shot is going through the entire line from the flank. And so it'll take out an entire file all the way across this line. You may find 10 or 15 people will be wiped out by a single cannonball. And they step over them, the next line, and move forward. So the idea that they're witnessing very horrible things is absolutely true. Everything around them when they're in this attacks are horrible. And yet what you find, and this has to do with their cohesion and their training and the fact they're veterans for the most part, they simply go forward. They close ranks and they move forward. They close ranks, they move forward until there aren't enough of them left to continue to close ranks and move forward.
Okay, let's go to the last question for this session.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panel and the Dole Institute for this great presentation. It's it's a rare opportunity to get to talk to so many experts about something. But here's my question. We had some discussion earlier about some of the fantasy around Joshua Chamberlain, and I had read that he was at Appomattox and he ordered his men to give the soldier salute to the surrendering South. and it was actually the first act of healing after the Civil War. And I was wondering if that was true, and exactly what is a soldier's salute? Thank you.
I think that's true. He
Speaking to
also-
your mics, please.
I believe that's true. He also did win the Medal of Honor. So he was a man of real courage, regardless of what did or didn't happen
He led the
at
parade.
Gettysburg. Elsewhere, he was a man of demonstrated courage.
And he was wounded 6 times during the war.
Didn't he lead also the Grand Army of the Republic? Did he lead the final parade, the victory parade in Washington? Wasn't his
Yes,
regiment
down
leading that
Pennsylvania
parade?
Avenue, yes.
He was selected after mathematics to receive the surrenders of the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia. And the story is, they're marching past him on the road, the Lynchburg Road, that stage road, that he ordered his men to shoulder arms and salute to the Confederates. There's been some issues raised about this, because one of the main sources, and I think, is John Brown Gordon, who has been shown to be not above making up stuff. But sure, keep it. But Chamberlain had a distinguished military career and a distinguished career afterwards.
Hey, wasn't he a 2-time governor of Maine or something like
Yeah.
that?
Governor of Maine.
Yeah.
and-
President of Bowdoin.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm desperately trying to remember the manual of arms, because it's not present arms when you hold your weapon out like this. I think it was, didn't they
It's something
carry it? It was like the soldier's salute, if I recall correctly, was the weapon up against your shoulder and just held down near
Yeah.
the trigger.
Your
if I
fingers
recall.
on the trigger guard,
Yeah.
just like that.
But that was the
Yeah.
soldier's salute.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. That
No.
concludes session 2. It's 4:17. We'll get started on the third and final day of Gettysburg at 4:30. Don't miss it.